Married Lou Theobald. I'm with Gannett. I've been with Gannett for 22 years in a variety of positions. The last 20 or so, I've managed the team that we're called Technology Learning Services. And while it sounds like a training team, we do user adoption. We're really working on some digital workplace things. How do we really impact the way people work? We talk about work. We talk about the ways people work. But a lot of our work processes haven't adapted to the modern workplace.
Sure.
And how do we do that? How do we help people work any place, anytime?
You're the superheroes.
Yes, the superheroes. We started an initiative, it was actually when we first migrated to Office 365 within that first year, called Reimagining Work. And the whole notion was, how do we think about our work differently? 6 years later, I really have come to shift that, and I call it renovate work, because we aren't at the point where we can just think about work differently. We have to actually tear down some walls and build new structures, or figure out how we need to set up structures and how we need to do that in a way that helps build our new work processes. I will say that is one of the things I really like about Teams, is it puts you in a place where you start interacting with people differently.
Obviously, culture is a huge part of what you stand for as an organization. We also talk to a lot of other organizations where they obviously are very clear that this is a cultural conversation today, but there's not the empowerment, I would phrase it, that you've given teams where they can go in and they have the empowerment to go solve their problems. If you're talking to one of your peers and they don't have that set up, and I'm guessing that's something you built 22 years ago when you came onto the team, what advice would you give them looking back to create that culture where we remove this constant concern about support and governance, so to speak, and really allow people to empower and create and solve their own challenges, have this accountability that we're transferring, if that makes sense?
So part of the way I approach things is a three-prong approach when you're doing adoption.
Sure.
I call it embrace, engage, and empower. The first stage is from a change management perspective. You just need to get people to embrace the fact that you're going to change them.
So really often.
Yes, that the communication is important. Here's what's going to happen. Here's why it's happened. Here's why it's important to our company. Here's what it's going to benefit us. You do that, and then when you move them in, or when you migrate them or bring them over to using a tool, and for us it was a migration from Skype to Teams that we put a lot of emphasis around. Then you start getting them to engage in the new features. Way
when you
back.
say new, we're talking the features that were different from the previous product, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things I do when I'm helping people adopt a tool is I list everything that the old tool can do and everything that the new tool can do. And you start matching it up. It really, I call it project-based training. You're following a project management flow, because that's really your gap analysis. They used to be able to do this, now they can't. You have to teach that and train that differently. Oh, we have something new. That's your golden ticket, if you will. Those are the things that you really want to highlight. This is going to take 3 clicks now, but we're going to give you so much more over here. So you really start making that. And when I talk about engage, it's how do we engage with the new tool. One of the tricky parts is you don't want there to be too much time between embrace and engage. Because if I just say, I'm going to move you over here, you're going to love it, you're going to be happy about it, they're going to go and use their work processes the same way they did before. You start to get them to engage with a new tool, and you start to roll out. I did this with some people lately. We put them in a team, let them start experimenting. Then within the team, I said, by the way, did you download the mobile app? Here are some things you can do. Oh, by the way, and you start introducing features and you bring them along. But the real sweet spot, I was glad you mentioned the word empower, because
that wasn't planned, by the way.
I know. You didn't see my notes. When you get to the point where you're empowering people to change their work processes, that's when you really know you've renovated work. You've really given them the opportunity to start acting differently.
That's so refreshing to hear your perspective on this, because again, this comes up so often, and everybody gets the cultural aspect, but I'm not sure it's really understood how critical that is to make it happen. So I'm really honest with customers. Teams is a different way of working, right? It's not Skype 2.0. It is not an extension of email. It is a very different way of working, and you've got to change mindset But when you do it the way you all have done, it's amazing hearing your story at Gannett, because you're unleashing these incredible work teams.
The other thing that I think is really critical when you start looking at this is not an IT initiative. I know I've heard you say that kind of thing before. You hear everybody say that, but you can't just think of it from the perspective of bits and bytes and, turning on Teams and whether or not you want it in island mode or whatever. You have to think about it much more holistically. There are a lot of people that are corporate communications, and there are a lot of people who are HR specialists or leaders, and they're looking at how do we communicate. And we need to step back and stop thinking about our collaborative tools from the IT perspective, but from the corporate communications, and how do we work, and how do we think about our work, which is a much more of an HR thing. And so I think when you start bringing those people into the conversation, and if you're thinking about this now and you haven't brought them in, it's really critical that you do that.
I mean, to summarize that thought, I mean, again, you've been Gannett for 22 years. Your organization has embraced this culture for such a long time. There's a lot of organizations who are a bit laggards or slower along that adoption curve, if so to speak. But what I find really interesting is when customers start to get it. I've actually had some verbatim tell me that this Teams can actually become the bridge between IT and the business in organizations where we've actually struggled with that relationship. Because it's not about control. In my mind, back to your point, it's about empowerment and enablement. And again, there's nuances to every industry, every organization, every geo. So there'll be some governance and some nuances again to the way that you support. But I love your perspective.
People like me, generally, I consider myself a champion. But you need that catalyst who is sometimes the person who is behind the scenes that you never even know exists, that's pushing the movement forward. And I like to think of the tool as the catalyst. And when you allow the tool to be the catalyst, you can be the person out front saying, we need to do that. But the tool is what's enabling. Underneath, it's enabling that ability to work differently. And so when you start to say, they're the engine behind me, and I have an image, a graphic that I use when I do presentations, and it's this arrow, and it's got somebody standing up in front of the arrow, kind of looking like, crossing the Delaware or whatever, and they've got all these, figures carrying the arrow. And if you think about that as the arrow being the tool and being the catalyst, we're all there supporting it, and you've got somebody there helping to run that. That's when you really have that ability to start empowering your work.
I could geek out with you for hours. This is so good.
We wrestle a lot with governance, and I don't know that we have the ideal situation, but right now we have it open. Everybody can create their own. I almost got to a panic point a week or so ago. Somebody was asking me about something, and I said, well, here, let me show you something in Teams. And while we were talking, he started creating. It's like, oh, maybe we've stepped 2 steps too far, but it worked out beautifully. They created 19 private teams within. We've got the general channel opened up. It was a way that they needed to invite external users in.
Sure.
And so we have all of these private channels where people can upload their content, and it's worked out really well.
So why leave it open? Why? Because obviously part of it's an empowerment, but the most common question we get asked is, that's great, I'd love everybody to do this, but I'm concerned about who's going to support these solutions afterwards. And what if we have 1,000 teams created in a week? Yeah. How did you get over that? It sounds like you had the same concerns, or at least you addressed those.
We had SharePoint where we provisioned, and then when groups came along, it's like, you guys realize people are creating their own SharePoint groups. It's got a SharePoint site. And that took a little bit of getting used to, but I think overall the mindset is, what are we trying to accomplish? And if you're really trying to accomplish a better work process, removing that barrier, let me tell you, on a Saturday, if there is a breaking news event, do I want the whole weight of the company on my shoulders for creating a team or creating a chat for them? No. I want them to be able to do their work and do what they need to do. We put in some placeholders or some checks and balances where you can go through and look to see if there's a team that hasn't been touched in a year, and you either try to notify the owner. If the owner isn't there anymore, then You know, so we decided we'd rather deal with it on the back end and clean up and do that kind of thing rather than be a barrier.
I applaud it. Thank you. I wish I could show
Well,
that.